The smell of roasted chicken and fresh bread filled the small restaurant. Chef Marco wiped his forehead with the back of his hand as he stood in the kitchen. It had been a long day, but he loved his job. Cooking made him happy, and seeing customers enjoy his food gave him a sense of purpose. Outside, the city was alive with noise. Cars honking, people talking, the distant sound of music from a nearby cafe. It was a normal evening, just like any other. The last few customers were finishing their meals, and the staff had started cleaning up. Marco stepped out through the back door to take a break. The cool night air felt good against his skin. As he lit a cigarette, something caught his eye. A small shadow moved near the trash bins at the back of the restaurant. At first, Marco thought it was a stray cat, but then he heard a rustling sound. Someone was digging through the trash. He frowned and stepped closer. The dim streetlight revealed a little girl, no older than 7 or 8. Her tiny hands searched through the garbage, picking out scraps of food. She moved quickly, stuffing a half-eaten sandwich into her pocket before reaching for another piece of bread. Marco's heart tightened. He had seen homeless people before, but never a child digging through his restaurant's trash. His first instinct was to speak, but he hesitated. He didn't want to scare her away. The girl, unaware that she was being watched, pulled out a small plastic bag and began filling it with food scraps. Marco could now see her better. She was painfully thin, her arms just skin and bones. Her dark hair was tangled, and her oversized shirt was stained and torn. But the worst part was her stomach. It was swollen, not with food, but with hunger. Marco had seen pictures of malnourished children in documentaries, but seeing it in real life was different. His chest ached as he realized just how hungry she must be. Taking a slow step forward, he cleared his throat gently. "Hey, sweetheart," he said in a soft voice. The girl froze. Her hands clenched around the bag of food as she turned to face him. Her large, frightened eyes met his, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "It's okay," Marco said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Are you hungry?" She didn't answer. Instead, she took a step back, ready to run. "Wait," Marco said quickly, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a freshly baked bread roll he had taken from the kitchen earlier. "Here, you don't have to eat from the trash. I can get you real food." The girl's eyes darted between the bread and Marco's face. She was still scared, but the hunger in her eyes was stronger. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped forward and grabbed the bread. She didn't say thank you. She just bit into it, chewing quickly, as if afraid someone might take it away. Marco crouched down to her level. "What's your name?" The girl didn't answer. She just kept eating. Marco studied her closely. She looked exhausted. Her hands trembled as she held the bread, and he noticed bruises on her arms. His stomach twisted. This child wasn't just homeless. She was in serious trouble. He had planned to go back inside and finish closing up for the night. But now, that didn't seem important anymore. This little girl needed help, and Marco knew he couldn't just walk away. Without thinking twice, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. Marco's fingers trembled as he held the phone to his ear. He had never called 911 before, but he knew this was an emergency. The little girl in front of him was starving, scared, and alone. 911, what's your emergency? A calm voice asked. Marco hesitated for a second, looking at the girl, who was still eating the bread as if she hadn't tasted food in days. Then he took a deep breath. "There's a little girl outside my restaurant," he said quickly. "She's digging through the trash for food. She looks very sick. I think she's malnourished." The operator asked for the restaurant's address, and Marco gave it. "Please hurry," he added. The girl was still standing in front of him, chewing quietly, her eyes darting around as if she was expecting someone to take the bread away. Her small fingers clutched the food so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Marco's heart ached. He wanted to say something, to comfort her, but he didn't know how. She was so young. Where were her parents? Why was she out here all alone? He crouched down again to her level. "Don't be scared," he said gently. "Help is coming." The girl stopped chewing. For the first time, she looked directly into his eyes. There was something in her gaze, fear, exhaustion, and something else. Something deeper. Marco realized she wasn't just afraid of him. She was afraid of everything. "Where do you live?" he asked softly. The girl shook her head. "Do you have a family?" No answer. A wave of anger and sadness rushed through Marco. How could someone let a child end up like this? He had spent his whole life making food for people, yet right outside his own restaurant, a little girl was starving. A police siren echoed in the distance, getting closer. The girl's eyes widened in panic. She dropped the last piece of bread and took a step back. "Hey, it's okay," Marco said quickly. "They just want to help you." But the girl shook her head violently. She turned and ran. Marco's heart pounded. "Wait," he called, running after her. She was fast, despite her tiny frame and weak body. She dashed through the alley, her bare feet barely making a sound against the pavement. Marco pushed himself to run faster, but she was small and quick, slipping through narrow spaces he couldn't fit through. He turned a corner and almost lost her in the darkness. Then, suddenly, she tripped. Marco reached her just as she tried to get up. She winced, holding her ankle. She had scraped her knee, and tiny drops of blood dotted her leg. Marco knelt beside her, breathing hard. "Hey, it's okay," he said between breaths. "I won't let anything bad happen to you." The sound of sirens grew louder. A police car pulled up near the alley, its red and blue lights flashing. 2 officers stepped out, followed by a paramedic carrying a first aid kit. The girl's chest rose and fell quickly. She looked terrified. Marco gently touched her shoulder. "These people can help you," he said softly. "You don't have to be afraid." One of the officers, a woman with kind eyes, crouched down. "Hi, sweetie," she said in a gentle voice. "We just want to make sure you're okay." The girl looked between Marco and the officer, unsure of what to do. The paramedic stepped closer. "She's injured," Marco said, pointing to her knee and her swollen belly. "And she hasn't eaten in a long time." The officer nodded. "We'll take care of her." Marco watched as the girl hesitated for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached out her hand to the officer. As the paramedics began checking her over, Marco felt a lump in his throat. He didn't know who this girl was or where she had come from. But one thing was clear: her story was far from over. And he wasn't going to walk away just yet. The little girl sat on the edge of the ambulance, her tiny legs dangling as the paramedic gently cleaned the scrape on her knee. She flinched but didn't cry. Her large eyes darted between Marco and the police officer, as if she was still deciding whether to trust them. Marco stood nearby, his arms crossed. He had spent years in a busy kitchen, where orders piled up and people shouted over the sizzling of pans. But this moment, standing here, waiting for the girl to speak, felt more intense than anything he had ever experienced. "She's severely malnourished," the paramedic said, glancing at Marco and the officer. "Her stomach is bloated from hunger, and she's dehydrated. She needs food, water, and medical attention." Marco's fists clenched. He had already guessed as much, but hearing it confirmed made his heart ache even more. The police officer, Officer Rivera, knelt beside the girl. "Sweetheart, can you tell us your name?" she asked gently. The girl hesitated, then shook her head. Marco sighed. "Has anyone reported a missing child around here?" he asked. Officer Rivera stood up and shook her head. "Not recently, but we'll check again." She turned back to the girl. "Do you have a home?" Silence. Marco couldn't take it anymore. "She needs food," he said. "Real food." He turned to the paramedic. "Can she eat now?" The paramedic nodded. "But something light. Her body isn't used to eating much." Marco didn't waste a second. He jogged back into his restaurant, moving so quickly that his staff looked up in surprise. He grabbed a bowl of warm soup, a slice of soft bread, and a bottle of water. Then he hurried back outside. Kneeling beside the girl, he handed her the soup. "Here, it's fresh." The girl stared at the bowl. The steam rose into the cool night air, carrying the smell of vegetables and herbs. Slowly, she reached for the spoon. She hesitated for just a moment before taking a small sip. Marco watched closely as she took another spoonful, then another. The way she ate, slow, cautious, as if she didn't believe the food was really hers, made his throat tighten. "You can have more if you want," he said softly. The girl didn't look up, but she kept eating. Officer Rivera sighed. "We should take her to the hospital for a full checkup. And then social services will need to get involved." Marco's stomach twisted. He knew the system. Some foster homes were good, but others weren't. And even if they found her a safe place, she would still be alone. Before he could stop himself, he spoke. "Can I go with her?" Officer Rivera looked surprised. "Are you a relative?" "No," Marco admitted. "But I don't want her to feel abandoned again. She trusts me, at least a little." The girl paused, glancing up at Marco for the first time since she started eating. Officer Rivera studied him. "It's unusual, but maybe." She turned to the girl. "Would you feel better if he came with you?" The girl nodded. That was all Marco needed to see. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know who this girl was or what she had been through. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let her face it alone. As the ambulance doors closed, Marco sat beside her, ready to take the next step in a journey neither of them had expected. The ambulance moved through the city streets, its siren now silent. Inside, Marco sat next to the little girl, watching as she held the bowl of soup tightly in her hands. She had finished eating but seemed afraid to let go of it, as if she thought the food might be taken away. Marco's heart ached. What kind of life had she been living that she didn't even trust that her next meal would come? The paramedic, a kind-looking woman named Lisa, smiled at the girl. "You're very brave," she said gently. "We'll check you at the hospital, and then we'll make sure you have a safe place to stay." The girl didn't answer. She just stared at her hands, her small fingers gripping the edge of the blanket they had given her. Marco leaned forward. "I know you're scared," he said softly, "but you're not alone anymore." The girl lifted her eyes to him for just a second before looking away again. Marco sighed. He wasn't good with kids. He had spent his life in kitchens, running a busy restaurant. He didn't know how to comfort a child, but something about this little girl made him feel responsible. The ambulance pulled up to the hospital, and the doors swung open. Nurses and doctors were already waiting. Lisa helped the girl out. "We're going to take care of you," she said kindly. A doctor bent down to the girl's level. "Sweetheart, can you tell me your name?" The girl hesitated. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper, she finally spoke. "Lily." Marco's eyes widened. It was the first time she had said anything. The doctor smiled. "That's a beautiful name, Lily. I'm Dr. Puttle. Let's get you checked up, okay?" Lily nodded slightly. Marco watched as the nurses led her inside. He started to follow, but one of the hospital staff stopped him. "Are you family?" "No," Marco admitted, "but I found her. She trusts me." The staff member hesitated, then nodded. "You can wait outside the examination room." Marco sighed in relief. He wasn't ready to leave her yet. He sat in the waiting area, watching as doctors and nurses moved around. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and something else, something heavy, like sadness. After what felt like forever, Dr. Patel came back. "She's malnourished, dehydrated, and has some minor injuries, but she'll recover," he said. "She needs rest and proper care." Marco felt some of the tension in his chest ease. "Thank you, Doctor." Officer Rivera arrived soon after. "Any updates?" she asked. Marco repeated what the doctor had said. Rivera sighed. "Social services will take over soon. They'll find her a place to stay." Marco hesitated. "And then what?" "Well, if no family comes forward, She'll go into foster care. Foster care. Marco had heard stories, some good, some bad. But even in the best case, Lily would still be alone. Before he even realized what he was doing, he spoke. What if? What if I took care of her? Officer Rivera looked surprised. You want to foster her? I don't know, Marco admitted. I just know I don't want her to end up in another bad situation. Rivera studied him. It's not that simple. You'd have to apply, go through background checks, and prove you can take care of a child. Marco nodded. Then tell me what I have to do. Rivera gave him a long look. You really care about this kid, don't you? Marco didn't hesitate. Yeah, I do. Lily had been abandoned once. He wasn't going to let it happen again. Marco sat in the hospital waiting area, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. It had been hours since they arrived, and Lily was still being monitored by the doctors. He had never been the kind of person to sit and wait. He was always moving, always working. But now, all he could do was think. Was he really considering fostering a child? He barely had time for himself. Running a restaurant was already a full-time job, and he had no experience with kids. But when he thought about Lily going into the foster care system, his chest tightened. What if she ended up somewhere unsafe? What if she had no one to care for her properly? He rubbed his face, letting out a deep breath. Officer Rivera walked up to him. Social services will be here soon, she said, sitting down next to him. They'll find a temporary home for Lily. Marco frowned. Temporary. Rivera nodded. For now, yes. They'll try to locate her family. If no one comes forward, she'll be placed into foster care permanently. The thought made Marco uneasy. And if I wanted to foster her? Rivera studied him for a moment. It's not impossible, she admitted, but it's a long process. You'd have to apply, go through background checks, and prove you can take care of a child. Marco sighed. I just don't want her to end up somewhere bad. I understand, Rivera said, but it's a big responsibility. Marco knew she was right. He had spent his life running a restaurant, not raising a child. But something about Lily made him feel protective. She had no one. And even though they had only just met, she already trusted him more than anyone else. Just then, a nurse walked over. She's awake, she said. You can see her now. Marco stood up quickly. Rivera followed him as they entered the hospital room. Lily was sitting up in bed, wrapped in a soft hospital blanket. Her big eyes looked up at Marco as he stepped inside. Hey, he said softly. How are you feeling? Lily didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. The doctor, Dr. Patel, gave Marco a small smile. She's still weak, but she's doing better. She needs proper nutrition and rest, but she'll be okay. Marco nodded, relieved. That's good. Rivera stepped closer. Lily, sweetie, she said gently. Social services is going to help find you a safe place to stay. Lily's small fingers gripped the blanket tightly. For the first time, Marco saw fear in her eyes. She didn't want to go. Marco felt a lump in his throat. He crouched down next to her bed. Hey, it's okay, he said softly. They just want to help. Lily's eyes darted between him and Rivera. Then, to everyone's surprise, she reached out, grabbing Marco's sleeve tightly. She didn't speak, but her grip said everything. Rivera sighed. Looks like she's already made her choice. Marco swallowed hard. He had been unsure before, but now, looking at Lily, seeing the way she clung to him, he knew. He couldn't let her go. Taking a deep breath, he turned to Rivera. Tell me what I need to do. Marco sat in the small office of the hospital, his hands clasped together. Across from him sat a social worker named Mrs. Thompson. She was a middle-aged woman with short gray hair and a serious expression. Officer Rivera stood nearby, arms crossed. Lily sat next to Marco, her small hand gripping his sleeve tightly. Mrs. Thompson looked at them both. Mr. Romano, she began, you understand that fostering a child is a big responsibility, right? Marco nodded. I do. You run a restaurant, correct? Yes. Do you live alone? Marco hesitated, then nodded. Yes, it's just me. Mrs. Thompson sighed. This is very unusual. Most people don't suddenly decide to foster a child they just met. Marco understood her doubt. It did sound crazy. But when he glanced at Lily and saw the way she held on to him, he knew it wasn't a mistake. I don't want her to end up in another bad situation, he said firmly. She trusts me. I don't want to break that. Mrs. Thompson looked at Lily. Sweetheart, do you have any family we can call? Lily didn't say anything. She just shook her head slowly. The social worker sighed again. For now, she'll have to stay in temporary foster care while we search for her relatives. Lily's grip on Marco's sleeve tightened. Her breathing became quick and uneven. Marco frowned. She doesn't want to go. She's scared, Mrs. Thompson said gently. But we have to follow the process. Marco took a deep breath. Then let me start the process. Rivera raised an eyebrow. You mean? I want to foster her, Marco said, his voice steady. I know I can't take her home today, but tell me what I need to do. I'll do it. Mrs. Thompson leaned back in her chair, studying him. After a long pause, she nodded. It's not easy, but if you're serious, we can start the paperwork. Lily looked up at Marco, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before. Hope. Okay, he said. Let's do it. A temporary goodbye. The next few hours passed in a blur. Mrs. Thompson explained the process. Background checks, home visits, and training sessions. Marco had a long road ahead, but he didn't care. He had made up his mind. The hardest part came when it was time for Lily to leave. A temporary foster family had been found, and they were waiting outside. Lily sat on the hospital bed, her tiny hands gripping the blanket tightly. Marco knelt beside her. Hey, he said gently. You're going to stay with some nice people for a little while. But I promise I'm not going anywhere. Lily's lips trembled. Her big eyes stared at him as if she was trying to understand. I'll visit you, Marco said. And soon, I'll bring you home. For a moment, Lily didn't move. Then, slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out something small. It was a crumpled napkin from Marco's restaurant. She had kept it all this time. She held it out to him. Marco took it carefully, his chest tightening. I'll keep it safe, he whispered. A tear slid down Lily's cheek. She wiped it away quickly, as if she didn't want anyone to see. Marco swallowed hard. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay. But he knew words weren't enough. So instead, he made her one last promise. I'll come for you, Lily, no matter what. As the social worker led Lily away, Marco stood there, watching until she disappeared through the doors. Then, for the first time in a long time, he felt something deep in his heart. This little girl had changed his life, and he wasn't going to let her go. The next few weeks were some of the hardest in Marco's life. The restaurant was still running, but his mind was always somewhere else, on Lily. Every night, he thought about her sitting in a stranger's home, wondering if she was okay. He had promised to bring her home, and he intended to keep that promise. But first, he had to prove he could take care of her. Marco spent every free moment working through the foster application process. He filled out forms, answered interview questions, and even attended parenting classes. He had never thought about being a father before, but now he wanted nothing more than to make sure Lily had a safe home. One evening, after a long day at the restaurant, he received a phone call. Mr. Romano. Mrs. Thompson's voice came through the line. Marco's heart pounded. Yes. We've completed your background check and home inspection, she said. There's still more to do, but so far, everything looks good. Marco let out a breath of relief. Does that mean I can see Lily? Mrs. Thompson hesitated. She's been asking about you, she admitted. She hasn't spoken much to her foster family. But yes, you can visit her tomorrow. Marco didn't even realize he was smiling. "Thank you," he said, reuniting with Lily. The next day, Marco arrived at the foster home early. It was a small house in a quiet neighborhood. He parked outside, gripping the steering wheel to steady himself. Would she still trust him? Would she still want to come with him? He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. A woman in her 40s answered. "You must be Marco," she said kindly. "I'm Mrs. Howard. Come in." He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room until he saw her. Lily sat on the couch, holding the same crumpled napkin from his restaurant. When she saw Marco, her eyes widened. For a second, she didn't move. Then, without a word, she ran straight into his arms. Marco knelt down, hugging her tightly. She was so small, so fragile, but at that moment, she felt like the strongest person he knew. "I told you I'd come," he whispered. Lily didn't say anything, but her grip tightened around him. Mrs. Howard smiled. "She's been very quiet since she got here, but I think you mean a lot to her." Marco swallowed hard. He had never thought of himself as someone a child could rely on. But now he knew he had to be. They spent the afternoon together. Marco brought Lily her favorite soup from the restaurant, and she ate every bite. He told her about the process, how he was working to bring her home. Lily listened carefully, nodding. She still didn't speak much, but Marco could tell she understood. When it was time to leave, she held onto his sleeve again. "I'll come back," he promised, "and soon I'll take you home." For the first time, Lily spoke. "You promise?" Her voice was soft, almost scared. Marco looked her in the eyes and nodded. "I promise." As he walked out of the house, he felt more determined than ever. No matter what, he was going to make sure Lily never had to feel alone again. The days after Marco's visit to the foster home passed quickly. Every chance he got, he was at the hospital or the social services office, making sure he did everything he could to move the process forward. His restaurant had never felt so empty. He spent more time thinking about Lily than about the menu or his customers. But he knew that if he wanted to bring her home, he needed to keep working. The training sessions were long and exhausting, but Marco never complained. He learned about child development, discipline, and how to create a safe environment. He had never thought about any of this before, but now it was all that mattered. Meanwhile, Lily's foster family told him that she was slowly opening up. She was still quiet, but she trusted Marco, and that was a good sign. A week later, Marco received another call from Mrs. Thompson. "Mr. Romano," she said, "I have some good news. You've passed the final evaluations. We've checked everything, and you're now approved to be Lily's foster parent." Marco felt his heart race. "So, she can come home with me?" Mrs. Thompson smiled over the phone. "Yes, she can." The moment of truth. It felt like a dream when Marco drove to the foster home that afternoon. His hands were steady on the wheel, but his stomach was full of butterflies. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. When he arrived, Mrs. Howard greeted him at the door. "She's been looking forward to this," she said, smiling. Marco stepped inside, and there, sitting on the couch, was Lily. She looked up at him with those big, trusting eyes. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she didn't move. Marco knelt in front of her. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Lily nodded, but she didn't speak. He smiled. "I know you're scared, but you're not alone anymore, okay? I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Lily finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "You promised." Marco felt his chest tighten. "I did, and I'm keeping that promise." With a small smile, Lily stood up and took his hand. It was the first time she had done that without hesitation. Marco gently led her outside to the car. A new home. The ride back to Marco's apartment was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt peaceful. Lily sat in the passenger seat, her eyes wide as she looked out the window at the world passing by. She was finally leaving the foster home, and going somewhere she could truly belong. When they arrived at Marco's apartment, he showed her around. It was small but cozy. There was a sofa, a small kitchen, and a bedroom with a soft bed waiting for her. "This is your new home," Marco said gently, "and we'll make it as comfortable as we can together." Lily looked around, her eyes softening. She walked to the window, staring out at the city. For the first time, Marco saw her smile, a small, quiet smile, but one that spoke volumes. He went into the kitchen and made them both a simple meal. As they sat together at the table, eating the food Marco had prepared, he realized how much he had changed. He had gone from a busy chef with no time for anything but his restaurant to someone who had found purpose in caring for Lily. The weeks that followed were filled with small moments of progress. Lily slowly began to open up, telling Marco more about her past and her dreams. They had movie nights, and Marco taught her how to make simple dishes in the kitchen. She was beginning to feel like a real part of his life. A family is born. One evening after dinner, Lily looked up at Marco. "Are we a family?" Marco paused, his heart swelling with love for the little girl sitting across from him. "Yes, Lily, we are. You and me, we're a family." Lily smiled, the happiest smile Marco had ever seen. It was the smile of a child who had finally found a place where she felt safe, loved, and accepted. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Marco knew one thing for sure: he would always keep his promise to Lily. Together, they had built a new life, a life full of hope, love, and a future brighter than either of them had ever imagined. And from that moment on, Marco knew that no matter what happened, Lily would always be his family.